Stop everything you're doing right now. Because what T.I. allegedly said about his son, King Harris, has sent shockwaves across the internet, and people are calling it one of the most controversial father-son moments in hip-hop history. Right now, social media is completely on fire. Clips are circulating at high speed, opinions are clashing in every comment section, and everyone is asking the same uncomfortable question. Did T.I. just emotionally give up on his own son in the most brutal way possible? Because according to resurfaced footage, viral conversations, and old interviews being recirculated, this is no longer being seen as a simple family disagreement. The internet has turned it into something heavier, more emotional, and far more complicated than anyone expected. At first, the conversation was about discipline, parenting, and tough love. People were debating whether strict parenting is necessary when a child grows up in fame. But very quickly, that debate shifted into something darker. Now the narrative being pushed online suggests that T.I.'s recent comments don't sound like guidance anymore. They sound like emotional exhaustion. And that's exactly why people are divided. Some are calling it honesty. Others are calling it heartbreaking. And a huge number of viewers believe this situation is a direct example of what happens when fame, street history, and generational pressure collide inside one family. But here's where things get even more intense. This isn't the first time T.I. and King Harris have been in the spotlight for conflict. Over the years, their relationship has repeatedly played out in public. Live arguments, emotional exchanges, viral clips, arrests, accusations, and moments that quickly turned private tension into public entertainment. And now, with these older moments resurfacing again, people are starting to connect dots that may or may not actually belong together. To understand why this situation feels so explosive, you have to go back before the internet started reacting, before clips went viral, and before everyone suddenly became an expert on their family dynamic. This story begins inside one of hip-hop's most influential households, a household built on fame, discipline, survival, and a father who has already lived through the darkest parts of street life and legal consequences. That father is T.I., a Grammy-winning rapper, actor, entrepreneur, and one of the most recognizable voices in modern hip-hop. But beyond the fame, his life story carries a very different weight. He is someone who has openly survived legal battles, federal prison time, and years of instability before building his career back up. For someone like that, parenting doesn't come from theory. It comes from experience. And that experience shapes how he sees the world and how he tries to protect his children from repeating the same mistakes. That's where King Harris enters the picture. From the outside, King grew up with everything: luxury homes, private education, media attention, and early exposure to reality television through Family Hustle, where audiences watched him grow up in real time. But behind the cameras and curated family moments, there was something more complicated forming: identity pressure. Because growing up as the child of a famous figure is not just about privilege, it's about expectations. And in King's case, those expectations were constantly shaped by the public. At first, he was seen as the celebrity kid living a comfortable life. But as he got older, that image began to shift. The internet stopped seeing him as just T.I.'s son and started watching him as an individual trying to define himself under a microscope. And that's where tension began to build. Small incidents started turning into viral moments. Viral moments turned into controversies. And eventually, those controversies turned into public discussions about behavior, discipline, and identity. One of the earliest viral incidents that brought this dynamic into focus happened at a fast food restaurant in Atlanta. What should have been a minor disagreement quickly escalated into shouting, recording, and live-streamed confrontation. Within hours, the clip spread everywhere. And for the first time, King Harris wasn't just a celebrity child anymore. He was a headline. But the attention didn't slow down after that. In fact, it intensified. Every public appearance, every reaction, every emotional moment became content for the internet to dissect. And as the pressure increased online, it also increased inside the family. T.I., who had spent years trying to shield his children from the environment he came from, began facing a difficult reality. He could not fully control how his son would navigate identity, independence, and public attention. That's where the emotional fracture began. Because King wasn't just pushing back against rules. He was pushing back against perception, authority, and expectation. And more importantly, he was pushing back against the image of who he was supposed to be. As time went on, things escalated further. Public disagreements became more intense. Emotional live streams began circulating. Private family tension started becoming public entertainment. And each moment made the situation feel less like normal parenting and more like a public breakdown being watched in real time. But what makes this dynamic even more complicated is that both father and son appear to be operating from completely different emotional realities. From T.I.'s perspective, he is seeing danger ahead, patterns he recognizes because he has lived them himself. He believes he is warning his son, guiding him away from a path that he understands too well. From King's perspective, however, that same guidance can feel like pressure, control, expectation, and constant comparison to an image he never fully agreed to live up to. And in between those two perspectives sits the internet, millions of viewers turning every disagreement into commentary, analysis, and debate. As more incidents accumulated over the years, the story kept escalating. Legal issues, public feuds involving other personalities, and viral arguments turned the family into one of the most discussed topics in hip-hop culture. Each new event didn't replace the last one, it added to it. Layer after layer, the narrative became heavier, more emotional, and harder for the public to interpret fairly. Until something unexpected started to happen. The tone began to shift. Not toward more chaos, but toward reflection. In more recent moments, T.I. has spoken differently in interviews. Less anger, more understanding. More reflection on fatherhood, responsibility, and the complexity of raising children under public scrutiny. At the same time, King has also shown moments that suggest change. Moments of maturity, acknowledgement, and awareness of how public perception affects his life. But despite these subtle shifts, the internet continues to pull older clips back into the present, reshaping them with new interpretations and emotional reactions. And that's why this situation refuses to settle. Because at this point, it's no longer just about one statement or one viral moment. It has become a larger conversation about parenting, fame, identity, and the impossible pressure of growing up in the public eye. Some people believe T.I. is simply a father trying to protect his son, using tough love shaped by real-life experience. Others believe the emotional weight of that pressure may be too heavy, especially when lived out under constant public observation. And that is where the internet remains completely divided. No middle ground, no simple answer, only perspective. So now the real question becomes, is this a story about a father trying to save his son from a difficult path he already understands? Or is it a story about a young man trying to find himself while being constantly shaped by expectations he never chose? Because right now, every new clip, every old interview, and every resurfaced moment is adding another layer to a story that still doesn't feel finished. And the most unpredictable part is this. With the way things have been going, the next moment that surfaces could change everything all over again. And slowly, the internet started noticing something strange. The same relationship that once looked completely broken was no longer in constant explosion. The arguments weren't happening every moment. The viral fights weren't appearing as frequently. For a brief period, it almost looked like things between T.I. and King Harris might finally be stabilizing. But just when that sense of calm started to form, the past came rushing back into the conversation. Old clips resurfaced, old interviews were reanalyzed, and moments that people had already moved on from years ago suddenly became evidence again in a new wave of online interpretation. That's when the internet started building a new narrative, one that suggested there might be a deeper emotional truth behind everything T.I. has ever said about his son. And once that idea took hold, the entire story shifted again. Because what people think they understand about this father-son relationship is now being tested in real time, in ways nobody fully expected. The tension between T.I. and King Harris didn't explode in a single moment. It was built slowly over time, through small disagreements, emotional misunderstandings, and repeated situations that escalated because neither side ever truly felt fully understood. What began as a normal father-son dynamic gradually turned into something the public couldn't stop watching, analyzing, and debating. At the core of it, all were two completely different perspectives colliding. On one side there was T.I., a man who had already lived through the harshest realities of street life, legal trouble, and the consequences that come with decisions made too early in life. He wasn't speaking from theory or assumption. He was speaking from experience. Every warning he gave his son came from a place of survival, from a life where one mistake could change everything permanently. To him, fame didn't make things easier. It made them more dangerous because every action becomes public and permanent. From his perspective, raising a child in that environment meant one thing: discipline, structure, and constant correction. On the other side was King Harris, a young man growing up under a spotlight he never asked for, constantly compared to his father, constantly judged by strangers online, and constantly expected to behave according to an image already created for him. From King's perspective, the issue wasn't discipline, it was identity. He wasn't just trying to rebel. He was trying to exist as his own person in a world that had already decided who he was supposed to be. Every move he made was amplified. Every emotion was recorded. Every mistake was replayed endlessly across social media. And that pressure created frustration that often came out in ways the public didn't fully understand. As time went on, clips, arguments, and old moments began resurfacing online, and people started connecting dots that were never meant to be connected in the same emotional timeline. Old disagreements, emotional live streams, family moments that once felt private were suddenly turned into public case studies. And once that happened, the story stopped being just about a family. It became entertainment. It became debate. It became controversy. And social media made it worse by turning every interaction into a final judgment. A raised voice wasn't seen as frustration. It was labeled disrespect. A strict warning from a father wasn't seen as concern. It was labeled control. A son's emotional reaction wasn't seen as struggle. It was labeled rebellion. Everything became simplified. Everything became extreme. And in that simplification, context disappeared. Then came the moment that changed how the internet viewed the entire situation. A public family exchange surfaced where emotions ran extremely high. It wasn't just a disagreement. It felt like a breakdown in communication happening in real time. Words were exchanged that reflected years of built-up tension, not just a single argument. And what made it even more intense was that it happened in a public setting, with no space for privacy, reflection, or calm resolution. After that moment, King's response online added an entirely new layer to the situation. Instead of letting things settle privately, emotions spilled onto social media, where millions of people immediately began dissecting every sentence, every tone, every word choice. Some viewers saw pain, some saw anger, some saw disrespect. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Something deeper was clearly happening beneath the surface. This is where public perception began to shift. At first, most people were on T.I.'s side. He was seen as a disciplined father trying to protect his son from a world he personally survived. His past made his warnings feel more serious, more grounded, and more justified. Many believed he was simply doing what a responsible parent does in a high-pressure environment. But as more context resurfaced, that simple narrative began to break apart. People started noticing that King wasn't reacting randomly. He was reacting to years of pressure, expectation, and constant public comparison. The internet then split into two completely different interpretations of the same story. One side saw discipline and protection. The other side saw emotional strain and identity pressure. And both sides believed they were right. What made the situation even more complicated was that neither T.I. nor King was fully wrong, in a traditional sense. T.I. was trying to protect his son from a world he knew could destroy him. King was trying to figure out who he was while living under the shadow of a powerful legacy and constant public judgment. And when those two realities collided, neither side could fully compromise without feeling like they were losing themselves. Behind the scenes, the situation was even heavier than what the public could see. Because fame removes privacy from conflict, in normal families, disagreements stay behind closed doors. They cool down, they get revisited, they often heal quietly. But in this case, every disagreement had an audience. Every emotional moment had commentary. Every misunderstanding had a narrative built around it before either person could fully explain their side. And that is what turned a family dynamic into a public debate that never really stops evolving. The situation had reached a point where the real issue was no longer just disagreement, but how that disagreement was being interpreted and amplified by the public. As pressure increased, the way people communicated around the situation began to change. Instead of speaking openly and calmly, reactions became defensive. Listening slowly gave way to preparing counterarguments. ND solving problems was replaced by managing public perception. Over time, this shift made even minor conflicts appear far larger than they actually were. Social media attention added fuel to the fire, turning private emotional exchanges into public debates. Within this environment, the emotional distance between the father and son became more visible to outsiders. Yet at the same time, there were still moments that reflected care, concern, and underlying love. This contradiction became central to why the story attracted so much attention. It was never a simple narrative of separation, but rather a complex relationship between two people who clearly cared for each other, yet consistently clashed over how that care should be expressed. As the situation developed further, some people began to reinterpret T.I.'s behavior. What once appeared as strictness or harsh parenting was increasingly seen by some as fear. Fear of watching his son repeat mistakes he had already experienced in his own life. Fear of losing control over a situation he believed he understood deeply. And fear that, despite repeated warnings, lived experience might still be the only teacher that could deliver the lesson. On the other hand, King's responses were also viewed differently over time. Instead of being seen purely as rebellion, a growing number of viewers began to recognize emotional pressure. Constant observation, correction, and comparison can quietly build frustration over time. When that pressure eventually surfaces, it often appears more intense than the actual cause behind it. This marked the first major turning point in public perception. The internet stopped viewing the situation in simple terms of right versus wrong. Instead, it became a layered emotional conflict where both sides had valid points, both sides carried emotional pain, and both were reacting based on lived experience rather than simple misunderstanding. As this complexity grew, public attention intensified rather than fading. Once a story becomes emotionally divided, people do not let it go easily. They continue analyzing, searching for new details, and waiting for the next moment that might confirm or challenge their beliefs. Eventually, the situation escalated further. It stopped being just a private family matter and became part of public entertainment. Once that happened, it no longer belonged solely to the individuals involved. It became owned by internet interpretation. Every new clip, old memory, or minor interaction was reinterpreted through a more dramatic lens. What were once private parenting moments were now treated as evidence of a deeper ongoing conflict. As more analysis took place, interpretations grew increasingly extreme. T.I. was no longer seen simply as a father trying to guide his son, but as a public figure constantly expected to defend his parenting style. Meanwhile, King was no longer just a young man growing up under pressure. He became, in the eyes of some, a symbol of rebellion, and in the eyes of others, a cautionary example. The escalation truly began when older incidents resurfaced. This time, they were not viewed as isolated moments, but as parts of a continuous timeline. A heated argument here, a viral outburst there, and other past issues in between were all connected into a single narrative. Even though these events occurred in different emotional contexts, the internet constructed them as one ongoing story. Once that timeline formed, theories quickly followed. Some believed T.I. had long been warning about the consequences of certain choices. Others argued that King had been under excessive pressure for years and was simply reacting to expectations he never chose. At the same time, occasional public responses from both sides added more fuel to the situation. Even small comments were amplified, analyzed, and turned into headlines. Vague statements were dissected word by word, often becoming more dramatic in interpretation than intended. Eventually, the conversation shifted away from what actually happened and toward what people believed was happening behind the scenes. This marked a darker phase of the narrative, where discussions moved from disagreement to assumptions of irreversible breakdown. Many began to believe reconciliation was impossible simply because the public version of the conflict appeared too chaotic to repair. However, the reality was more nuanced. T.I. was not only reacting emotionally, but also navigating the challenge of being a father under constant public scrutiny while carrying the weight of his own past. Having experienced legal troubles, mistakes, and consequences himself, he understood how quickly situations can spiral when decisions are made without long-term thinking. That experience shaped his approach, whether or not others agreed with it. Meanwhile, King was dealing with identity under constant observation. Growing up with a well-known name meant every action was magnified, criticized, or compared. Then, ordinary behavior could be interpreted as controversy when viewed by millions. This kind of pressure does not disappear, it accumulates over time. This led to another major shift in perception. People began to realize the conflict was not simply about discipline versus rebellion, but also about two generations trying to define very different ideas of protection and freedom. One generation believes protection comes through strict guidance, while the other believes freedom is essential for growth. Neither perspective is entirely wrong, yet neither can fully accept the other. As this understanding spread, public opinion became more divided, but also more empathetic. Some viewers softened their judgment of T.I., seeing his actions as rooted in experience and fear. Others grew more understanding of King, recognizing the emotional strain of constant correction under public scrutiny. Yet this empathy did not resolve the situation. It deepened it, because now the conflict existed on multiple emotional levels at once. People were no longer just watching a family dispute. They were projecting their own beliefs about parenting, freedom, discipline, and respect onto it. Every interpretation carried emotional weight, and every viewpoint felt personally justified. Eventually, past interviews and conversations were revisited in light of new interpretations. Statements that once seemed casual were now seen as meaningful clues. Words previously ignored were reinterpreted as warnings. In this environment, a full psychological narrative was constructed without any major new developments actually occurring. At this stage, misinformation and interpretation began to blend together. And once that boundary starts to blur, the line between truth and perception becomes extremely thin. Meanwhile, both T.I. and King Harris were continuing to live their lives in real time, but under conditions that most people outside the spotlight could never fully understand. Imagine having every disagreement potentially recorded, every emotional reaction clipped, and every private moment turned into public discussion within minutes. In that kind of environment, the way people naturally behave begins to change. Instead of reacting freely, individuals start thinking about how their words and emotions will look online. Instead of resolving conflicts privately, they become aware that every interaction might be interpreted, judged, or even misrepresented by millions of viewers. Over time, this constant awareness adds a silent but powerful layer of pressure to already tense situations. Even when things appear calm from the outside, that pressure never fully disappears. It simply becomes hidden beneath the surface. And just when it seemed like the narrative had reached its highest emotional intensity, another layer of complexity emerged. Despite all the conflict and public debate, there were still visible signs of connection between T.I. and King. Small moments of understanding, occasional positive interactions, and subtle indications that the relationship was not completely broken added confusion to the overall story. This contradiction made the internet even more divided because people tend to expect stories like this to follow a straight line. In most public perception, conflict is supposed to lead directly to separation, but real human relationships rarely work that way. They move in cycles, moments of tension followed by moments of understanding, distance followed by closeness, silence followed by communication. And that cycle is exactly what kept this story alive. It wasn't sustained because it was simple, but because it was complicated. As this phase of escalation slowly came to a close, one thing became clear. The most surprising element wasn't just the conflict itself, but the fact that no one outside the situation could fully define what it actually was. To some it was discipline, to others it was pressure, and for many it was both at the same time. Once the conflict reached peak visibility, it stopped being just a private family matter and transformed into a full internet event. At that stage, everyone had an opinion, but very few people had real context. And that is exactly what made the reaction so intense. People were no longer reacting to verified facts. They were reacting to emotions, short clips, and interpretations that spread far faster than clarification ever could. The first wave of public reaction was immediate and chaotic. Social media platforms filled with debates, commentary threads, stitched videos and breakdowns analyzing every possible angle of T.I. and King Harris's relationship. Some viewers focused heavily on T.I.'s past experiences, framing him as a father shaped by hardship who was trying to prevent his son from repeating the same mistakes. From this perspective, discipline was not seen as control but as protection. Supporters emphasized responsibility, consequences, and the harsh realities of environments where one wrong decision can permanently alter a life. However, an equally strong opposing reaction emerged. Another group interpreted the situation very differently. They saw King as a young man growing up under constant pressure, trying to form his identity while being compared to a well-known and influential figure at every step. To them, what appeared as discipline felt more like emotional intensity and overwhelming expectations. They argued that growing up in fame does not remove the need for emotional understanding. In fact, it increases it. Constant public attention can make normal development more difficult, not easier. As both sides became louder, the internet did what it always does. It split the narrative into teams. Team T.I. and Team King, became informal labels circulating across comment sections and reaction videos. But what made this situation different from typical celebrity drama was its emotional depth. This was not just about a single incident or viral moment. It was about parenting, legacy, generational trauma, and identity under pressure. As discussions intensified, older clips resurfaced. However, they were no longer viewed as isolated moments. Instead, they were reinterpreted as part of a continuous storyline. A heated argument from the past became proof of ongoing conflict. A brief disagreement became symbolic of deeper, unresolved issues. Even neutral interactions were reanalyzed through the lens of current assumptions. Entertainment pages and commentary channels quickly amplified the situation. Every minor update became a headline. Every reaction became content. Every detail was exaggerated for engagement. In such an environment, nuance disappears quickly. What remains is fast, emotional interpretation, often incomplete but highly shareable. Meanwhile, longtime fans of T.I. reflected on his past interviews, where he openly discussed his own mistakes and how they shaped his approach to parenting. This background led some people to view his actions differently, not as control, but as fear of repetition. A fear rooted in lived experience and the understanding of how quickly youthful decisions can lead to long-term consequences. At the same time, younger audiences connected more with King's perspective. The feeling of being misunderstood, of wanting independence while still being guided, felt relatable. From their viewpoint, the issue was not rebellion but expression. They questioned whether strict, highly public guidance sometimes creates resistance rather than resolution. This generational divide became one of the main reasons the story kept trending. It was no longer just celebrity gossip. It became a reflection of broader societal disagreements about parenting, discipline, and emotional communication. Even industry voices began to subtly join the discussion, often without naming anyone directly. Conversations about raising children in the spotlight, pressure of legacy, and emotional development under fame began appearing in interviews and podcasts. Some emphasized how difficult it is to raise children when every mistake becomes permanent content. Others highlighted the importance of emotional space for young adults trying to build identity under scrutiny. Still, all of these discussions eventually circled back to T.I. and King Harris, because their situation had become symbolic of a larger cultural conversation. As public reactions continued, another layer of confusion developed, uncertainty about the actual current state of their relationship. Some updates suggested distance, while others hinted at improvement. Occasional positive appearances only made the narrative more complicated. Every time the internet believed it had clarity, something new would challenge that assumption. This inconsistency kept public attention alive. Uncertainty creates curiosity, and curiosity sustains engagement far longer than resolution ever can. Memes, reaction videos, debates, and commentary threads created a continuous cycle of reinterpretation. A single post could shift the tone of discussion within hours. A single clip could reignite debates that had temporarily faded. New audiences constantly entered the conversation without full context, further reshaping the narrative. Yet beneath all the noise, one thing remained constant: people cared. Not just about the drama itself, but about what it represented. A father trying to guide, a son trying to grow, a relationship shaped by love, pressure, expectation, and identity. Many people saw fragments of their own experiences reflected in the story, whether as parents, children, or individuals caught between independence and responsibility. As the discourse reached its peak, the conversation slowly began shifting into reflection. Instead of only asking who was right or wrong, people started asking why conflicts like this happen so frequently in families under pressure. This marked a transition from escalation to reflection. As time passed, the tone of the conversation escalated. Abruptly changed. What once felt like a permanent, unresolved conflict began showing signs of softening. Public reactions became less aggressive. The intensity of new controversy slowed down. While the internet had previously framed the situation as an inevitable breakdown, reality appeared more complex. Behind the scenes, a quieter process was unfolding, not dramatic confrontation, but gradual recalibration. Both T.I. and King had been living under constant pressure from public interpretation, industry expectations, and constant scrutiny. Over time, that pressure changed how even conflict itself behaved. Instead of feeding public discussion, there were signs of stepping back from it, not necessarily from each other, but from the noise surrounding them. This shift marked a turning point. For the first time, the narrative was no longer driven by new controversy, but by reflection. T.I.'s actions began to be seen through a more nuanced lens. Some observers started recognizing that his behavior might have been shaped less by anger and more by fear. Fear of watching a loved one repeat cycles he himself had struggled to escape. Similarly, King's public image also began to shift. He was increasingly seen not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a young person growing up under constant visibility. Every mistake magnified, every emotion public, every stage of development exposed to external judgment. When both perspectives are considered together, the narrative becomes softer, but also more complex. However, even this period of relative calm introduced new uncertainty. In celebrity-driven stories, silence is never neutral. It gets interpreted, analyzed, and filled with assumptions. As public tension decreased, new questions emerged. Was this the beginning of reconciliation, or simply a pause before another wave of conflict? Opinions split once again. Some believed healing was happening privately. Others believed silence was temporary. Eventually, another shift occurred, not in the story itself, but in the audience. Many people began to step back, not because they stopped caring, but because the narrative became too complex to reduce into simple opinions. This exhaustion changed the nature of discussion. Instead of outrage, reflection became more common. People began discussing the broader issue, how family struggles become public entertainment, and how digital platforms turn emotional experiences into viral content. And then came the final realization. Looking back, it became clear that almost every stage of this story had been shaped more by interpretation than by complete reality. The public had only ever seen fragments, short clips, partial statements, and emotionally charged moments taken out of context. Those fragments, repeated and reshared, formed a narrative that felt complete but never truly was. And that leaves one final question. If this story was shaped so heavily by perception rather than full truth, how many other viral family conflicts are also far more complex than what the internet is ever able to see? Because in the end, what people call the story is often just the point where public understanding stops, not where reality ends.